All right, so welcome to our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at kind of a fix of history, international relations, all through the lens of India.
Sounds good.
We've got a couple of sources here, right? So we've got this really interesting speech
Mm.
by the Prime Minister of India, and it was given at a really significant event, the 100th anniversary of the Hindustan Times newspaper.
Wow.
Yeah. And then the other thing we've got is this press release.
Okay.
And this press release details the prime minister's upcoming travels.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So 5 days, 3 different countries. So we're going to take a look at, kind of what he had to say at this anniversary event and then kind of where is he going and what can we maybe glean from
Yeah.
that press release.
Makes sense. Might seem like an odd pairing at first glance.
It's going to say, like,
Right.
how do we connect those two things?
Correct.
But the prime minister himself actually makes a really interesting connection between those two seemingly disparate topics. Yeah. So first of all, I want to point out that he spoke at the Hindustan Times 100th anniversary event.
Mhm.
And it's cool because 100 years ago at the founding of this newspaper, Mahatma Gandhi spoke.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. So it was a really significant event. I think a lot of people were watching it. And in his speech, the prime minister talks about how the Hindustan Times, like the journey of that newspaper over the past century,
Mm.
mirrors India's own journey
Mm.
from, the struggle for independence to navigating the post-independence challenges and aspirations.
Wow, that's a great comparison.
Yeah. So, I thought that was just a really interesting way to frame it.
Yeah.
And he uses specific historical events that the newspaper covered to illustrate this point, which I thought was really cool.
Oh, that's neat. Give me an example.
Yeah, so like the first one that he mentions is Kashmir's accession to India in 1947,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
which, I'm sure as,
Dude.
hugely important. But then he didn't shy away from the difficult parts of that, right? He points out that there was all this indecision in the aftermath of that,
Yeah.
and it fueled decades of violence. But then he contrasts that with recent coverage in the Hindustan Times, talking about the record voter turnout in Jammu and Kashmir, and kind of uses those two things side by side
Wow.
to highlight the progress that's been made. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, it shows the power of like seeing those headlines side by side, right?
Yeah.
You really get a sense of how things have changed over time.
Yeah, totally.
And it makes you think about how the media shapes those national narratives and public perception.
For sure, yeah. It's not just like passively documenting these events. It's like they are actively contributing to this evolving story of
I see.
India. And he goes on to talk about other significant moments, like Assam being declared a disturbed area and the BJP's role in eventually bringing peace to that region. And of course, the 26/11 Mumbai terror attacks.
Yeah.
He kind of talks about those as a turning point, forcing a change in how India combats terrorism. And I think he doesn't explicitly say this, but it seems like the implication is that it also shifted like how the Hindustan Times covered terrorism, right? Like how did they frame that story?
Yeah. It makes you think about like how all nations grapple with their history, right?
Yeah.
Especially the more difficult chapters. And I think that the media plays a huge role in that.
Yeah.
So in India's case, it sounds like the Hindustan Times was kind of both a witness to these events, but also, like you said, an active participant in this dialogue
Totally.
about the country's past, present, and future.
Exactly. And speaking of the future, he talks a lot about the resilience of the Indian people.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and this idea that like experts have often underestimated India's ability to overcome challenges. Like he points to all these predictions that people have made over the years that simply didn't come true.
Like what kind of predictions are we talking about?
Well, some people predicted that India would fall apart after the British left.
Right.
Or that democracy wouldn't survive.
During the emergency, yeah.
Exactly, the emergency period. Or even more recently, that India would become like a burden on the world.
Oh, wow.
During the COVID-19 pandemic.
Wow.
And it's amazing how those predictions never came to pass.
So what's he saying? Like, what's his point about those predictions being wrong?
Well, I think what he's saying is that those weren't just like flukes. India defied expectations because of its inherent strength,
right?
The resilience and the capability of its people. And I think that's a really powerful message.
Yeah.
Especially, I think, in the context of like shifting global power dynamics.
Right.
Like we're seeing emerging economies like India playing a bigger role on the world stage.
For sure.
So this internal strength that he's talking about, I think, translates into international standing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, a nation's internal strength can be like its greatest asset when it comes to global influence.
For sure. So then he goes on to critique what he calls vote bank politics, which I think is interesting. This idea that, like, there's this kind of short-term focus on, gaining political advantage rather than this, like, long-term vision for development that benefits everyone. And he says, for years, good economics was seen as bad politics.
So I guess he's saying that his approach is different then.
Yeah, totally. He's really emphasizing this development-oriented governance that focuses on progress for all citizens, not just specific groups. And he points to some really interesting specific initiatives like the Swachh Bharat mission, that was a big campaign to build toilets across India.
Oh, right, yeah.
And he argues that this is, it's not just about hygiene. It's about dignity. It's about security, particularly for women.
Wow.
And even economic activity.
That's interesting. I mean, it's like something so basic has such a ripple effect.
Huge ripple effect.
Yeah.
He also talks about the expansion of LPG gas connection, which, is providing cleaner cooking fuel to millions of people, particularly in rural areas.
Right.
And again, that's about like quality of life, reducing indoor air pollution, and empowering women, often the ones who are, managing these tasks in the household.
That's a great point.
Yeah. And then he talks about this direct benefit transfer scheme, or DBT.
Okay.
And I think this one is really cool because it's using technology to deliver subsidies and welfare payments directly to people's bank accounts.
So cutting out the middleman.
Exactly. So it's reducing corruption, ensuring that people are actually getting the help that they need.
Wow. So simple, but such a good idea.
I know. Isn't that cool? It's like such a simple solution, but it makes such a big difference. And then he goes on to talk about the Ayushman Bharat scheme, which is providing affordable health care to millions of low-income families.
Right.
He argues that this, along with efforts to make medicines and medical devices more accessible, has saved citizens billions in healthcare costs.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge step towards universal healthcare coverage.
Exactly, yeah. But it's not just about social programs, right?
Okay.
He also talks about this resurgence of risk-taking culture in India.
Interesting.
Yeah, he says that for a while after independence, there was this kind of hesitancy to take risks.
Right.
But that in the past decade or so, that's really changed.
Well, yeah. I mean, think about the startup scene in India.
Yeah.
It's exploded.
It's crazy. Yeah, he uses that. He talks about the growth of startups.
Right, exactly.
But he also mentions, which I thought was really cool, women in self-help groups becoming entrepreneurs.
Oh, that's awesome.
Taking risks, transforming their families' lives. So it's like this confidence and willingness to try new things is kind of spreading across different fields of society.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like something fundamental has shifted in India.
Yeah.
This embrace of risk, this innovation. I feel like that's going to be a huge driver of growth.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've got this picture of India, right? This nation with a rich and complex history, a resilient people, and this focus on development and risk-taking.
Yeah.
But how does all of this translate to India's role on the global stage? And I think that's where that second source, the press release about the Prime Minister's trips, kind of comes in.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it is a fascinating itinerary.
Yeah.
Nigeria, Brazil, Guyana. Very different parts of the world. It gives you a sense of how India is engaging with the world on all these different levels.
Totally. It's like a snapshot of their expanding global footprint.
I like that, yeah.
Snapshot.
It's a good way to put it.
Of their global footprint.
Yeah, so should we break down each of these visits a little bit?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so let's start with Nigeria. So this is the Prime Minister's first time visiting.
And the press release frames this as a chance to strengthen their strategic partnership.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, right? And a major economic power, so.
Yeah, it's a smart move for India.
Yeah.
It fits with this larger strategy of engaging with Africa, right? I mean, Africa's got huge potential, and they're playing an increasingly important role in the global economy.
Totally, yeah. It's like investing in the future, right? And what I thought was really interesting is how he talks about their shared democratic values.
Oh, interesting.
Like he specifically mentions that. He says, we share a belief in democracy and pluralism, which I thought was really interesting because he just talked about India's own journey with democracy and how it's endured despite challenges.
Right, exactly.
So it's like he's drawing this direct connection between their experiences and their relationship with Nigeria.
Yeah, it's more than just an economic partnership.
Yeah.
It's like they see them as a potential ally in promoting democracy
Totally.
and pluralism on a global scale.
Yeah.
Like exporting their values and experience.
It's a really interesting way to frame it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, he also mentions that he's really excited to meet the Indian community in Nigeria.
Oh, cool.
He talks about getting all these warm welcome messages, some of them even in Hindi.
Oh, that's nice.
I know. So it's cool how he, acknowledges that personal connection, right?
It highlights the power of diaspora diplomacy.
Yeah.
Which India has used effectively in other parts of the world as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so next up is Brazil.
Okay.
And of course, he's going to be attending the G20 summit.
Right.
Can you remind me, what is that again?
Yeah, so the G20 is a group of the world's 20 largest economies.
Okay.
They get together every year to discuss global economic issues. Things like financial stability, climate change, sustainable development.
Right.
It's a pretty big deal because they represent about 80% of the world's economic output and about 2/3 of its population.
Okay, yeah, so their decisions have a big impact.
Huge impact.
On everybody.
Yeah, for sure.
And India's attending as a Troika member this time, right? What does that mean?
So the Troika refers to the current, previous, and incoming presidencies of the G20.
Okay.
So since India had the presidency last year,
right,
they're still part of this leadership group.
Okay, so they get to kind of help shape the agenda.
Exactly.
Even though they're not the president this year.
Yep.
So it shows that they're seen as a leader.
Exactly. And the press release mentions how India, under their presidency, really focused on making it a people's G20.
Yeah.
Highlighting the priorities of the global South. And it seems like they want to continue pushing those priorities forward.
Yeah, so it's interesting how they're using their position to advocate for developing countries.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, we need to make sure that everybody benefits from global economic growth.
Right.
Not just the wealthiest nations.
Totally. And the G20, it's not just about those discussions, right? It's a great opportunity for all these bilateral meetings on the sidelines.
Okay, yeah, like backroom deals,
Yeah.
relationship building, all that good stuff.
Like speed dating for world leaders.
Totally, yeah.
So a chance for the prime minister to really have some one-on-one conversations with key leaders.
Right.
Maybe forge some new partnerships.
Yeah.
Advance India's economic and strategic interests.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, last but not least, we have Guyana.
Yeah.
This one, I have to admit, I was a little surprised by.
Okay.
So why is Guyana significant? What's the focus of this visit?
It might seem a little less high profile than the other two.
Yeah.
But it's really significant because it's the first visit by an Indian prime minister to Guyana in over 50 years.
Wow, 50 years. That's a long time.
It is.
So it seems like there's this renewed focus on that relationship and maybe India's engagement with the Caribbean in general.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the factors is that Guyana has a large Indian diaspora. There's this strong historical and cultural connection.
Right.
And it mentions in the press release that the prime minister is going to be addressing Guyana's parliament.
Wow, that's a big deal.
Yeah, which is a pretty big gesture of diplomatic engagement.
So they're not just swinging by for a quick hello.
No, they're serious about strengthening those ties.
Yeah, how does that historical connection, how does that impact their relationship today?
Well, it creates this natural bond, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a foundation for collaboration. I mean, they share this common heritage.
Right.
And that can lead to economic ties, political ties, even cultural ties.
Yeah.
So this visit is about building on that history and, expanding cooperation in new areas.
That makes sense. And then he is also attending a second India CARICOM summit, right?
Yes.
That's the group that brings India and leaders from all the Caribbean nations together.
Exactly.
It's a way for them to engage with the entire region collectively.
Yeah, this is a smart move.
Yeah.
It's a strategic approach to regional engagement.
Yeah, totally. So we've gone from this, microcosm of a single newspaper's journey to this macrocosm of India's engagement with the world.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
It's really cool. I think it's fascinating how those two narratives are kind of intertwined.
I agree. It's like, before we saw how the Hindustan Times coverage mirrored India's changing story.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing how India is taking a more active role on the world stage.
Totally.
It's like they're writing their own headline.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they're saying, hey, we're not just observers anymore.
Right.
We're active participants in shaping global affairs.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is how this outward-looking approach, going to all these different countries, is rooted in those internal transformations we were talking about.
Yeah.
The resilience, the shift towards development, the rise of risk-taking.
So it's like those internal strengths are fueling their global aspirations.
Precisely. A nation's domestic progress can be like the bedrock of its international influence.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so before we move on to part 3, where we'll kind of dig into the specific policies driving this transformation,
Okay.
I just want to pause and ask you, what's resonated with you the most so far? Like, what's been the biggest aha moment for you?
Oh, that's a great question. I think what struck me the most is just this sense of optimism and ambition that's coming from the prime minister.
Yeah.
It's like a declaration that India is ready to step up and be a global leader.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a feeling that India is at this pivotal moment, this moment of immense potential and possibility.
I think so, too.
Yeah, and you know what else I thought was interesting is the specific initiatives that he highlighted in his speech.
Yeah.
He kept going back to this idea of moving away from that vote bank politics towards this more development-focused approach.
Yeah, and he used that example of the Swachh Bharat mission,
Yes.
the campaign to build toilets and improve sanitation.
Yeah.
And his argument was that it wasn't just about hygiene. It was about dignity. It was about security, especially for women.
Yeah.
And it even had an impact on economic activity.
Yeah. I remember reading about that. It's pretty incredible to think about the scale of that initiative.
Well, it is.
Millions of toilets built across India.
It's a really powerful example of how development isn't just about, economic indicators.
Right.
It's about improving people's daily lives.
Yes.
In really tangible ways.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Access to proper sanitation.
Yeah.
That has a ripple effect.
Huge.
It impacts health, education, women's safety.
It's like laying the foundations for
Exactly.
progress in all these other areas.
Exactly.
And he highlighted other initiatives too, like the expansion of LPG gas connections.
Right, providing cleaner cooking fuel.
Yes, especially to people in rural areas. And again, that's about quality of life, reducing indoor air pollution, and empowering women.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating how, something as simple as switching from a traditional cook stove
to an LPG stove can have such a big impact.
It really can.
Yeah.
Yeah, indoor air pollution is a major health hazard
Yeah.
in many parts of the world, so that was a huge step forward.
Totally. And then there's the Direct Benefit Transfer Scheme, or DBT.
Right.
This is a great example of using technology to improve governance.
For sure.
Delivering subsidies and payments directly to people's bank accounts.
To their bank accounts.
It cuts out that middleman,
Yeah.
reduces the potential for corruption.
So the benefits actually get
Yes.
to the people who are supposed to receive them.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
I know. It's so simple, but such a good idea.
I know. It's such a good idea. He also spoke about initiatives in the healthcare sector, like Ayushman Bharat,
Yes.
providing health insurance.
To millions of low-income families.
Yes, and that was a big one for him, right?
So it was a flagship program.
Yeah.
And it's a major step toward universal health coverage,
Yeah.
which is the goal for so many developing countries.
Mm. And he also mentioned efforts to make medicines and medical devices more affordable.
Right, which is huge.
Yeah.
Because healthcare costs can be such a burden
Exactly.
for families.
And so it's this theme of, using government policy to address basic needs, improve people's lives,
Absolutely.
create this more equitable society.
Right.
But it's not just about social welfare, right?
Right.
He also talks a lot about fostering this culture
Yes.
of risk-taking and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, because he sees that as being key for driving economic growth and innovation.
Yeah, and he points to this startup scene in India as evidence.
Remember those numbers?
Crazy.
It's amazing.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And he talked about women in these self-help groups becoming entrepreneurs.
Taking risks.
Yeah, and transforming their families' lives.
It's inspiring.
It is.
Yeah.
So it's this blend of social progress, economic growth, and then a focus on innovation.
It's a pretty ambitious agenda.
It is. And of course, there are challenges. Right.
Of course, they're always challenging.
Poverty, inequality, climate change, all things that India still needs to grapple with. But there is this sense of momentum.
Yes.
And ambition.
Yeah, I agree. It does feel like a turning point.
And it brings us back to something we talked about earlier.
Okay.
The role of media.
Right.
He talked about how the Hindustan Times has shaped India's narrative over the past century as India continues to evolve.
Yeah.
Media is going to play an even bigger role.
Huge role.
In shaping perceptions, both within India and globally.
It's a lot of responsibility.
It is.
I mean, media has this power to inform, to inspire, to hold those in power accountable.
Yes.
But it can also be used to mislead, to divide, to manipulate.
It's a double-edged sword.
It is.
And I think it's up to all of us as consumers of information
No.
to be discerning, to question narratives, to seek out those diverse perspectives.
Especially in this day and age.
I know.
With information overload and social media, it's so easy.
So easy for misinformation to spread.
We have to be critical thinkers.
Yeah.
We need to engage in healthy skepticism.
Absolutely.
And just be aware of our own biases.
It's about media literacy.
It is. It really is.
You know, understanding how media works, how it can be used, how we can be more informed and responsible consumers.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So as India continues on this journey of transformation, I think it's really crucial that it has this vibrant and independent media
For sure.
that can provide accurate information,
Yes.
hold power accountable, and really contribute to a healthy and informed public discourse.
Well said.
As we wrap up our deep dive today,
Yeah.
I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
You know, the story of India, like any nation,
Yeah.
is ultimately about people. It's their hopes, their dreams, their struggles.
Yeah.
And it's a story that's still being written. And each of us, whether we are citizens of India or observers from afar, has a role to play in shaping that narrative.
Beautifully said.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
into India's journey. And we'll see you next time for another exploration of the ideas and events that are shaping our world.